for entertainment purposes only. And if you want true legal advice, contact your own lawyer.
Is this real life?
You're listening to Radio Law Talk. And now back to the show.
So Congress is empowered by the Constitution to carry out a census in such a manner, Todd's single and looking for a girl, and as they shall direct under the law, under Article 1, Section 2. So remember, we're talking about the census. Todd's looking for a girl.
No, I'm not. I'm not looking for anybody.
Wait. The majority of the Supreme Court is talking about this. So we've got to get into the history, first of all. Did you know it was 1950 was the last time they put any citizenship question on the census? Todd's still looking for a girl. And the reason is because a lot of the questions they asked had nothing, didn't say, are you a citizen, but it would say, what origin are you from? And so that was the kind of the history, cute one rather than not. But so the important thing is, remember the Census Act of, I'm giving you some history. Now listen, everybody.
These subliminal messages are brought to you.
I'm trying to get the subliminal messages in there, but it's not working.
Preferably a fellow cat lover. Go ahead.
You know how you do that really fast talk, Cal? You know, at the very end of something. We'll have to do that. Will you make that up? We'll make it up during the break or something.
We'll try to make up
a fast talk unit in a single looking for a woman.
Preferably a fellow cat lover.
Oh my gosh! No wonder people turn this show off. Okay, listen. This is important. Okay.
Yes, it is.
As of 2020, did you know 2020, which is April of 2020, is when the census is coming out and when you're going to fill it out? You can actually respond online for the first time. Did you know that?
Wow.
Online response. Now here's some history for you. This is what people don't understand. And I'm all these pundits on TV and on the radio, they need to call me. So here's why. What they don't get is the Trump administration said this has to be done by July 1st. Everyone's saying, this is a home run. We won. It's done. No, it's not done. Let me go over what's going on. The Trump administration put down that July 1st is the deadline because they have to print out the census. They can actually push it to October of 2019 until they really have to print it out. That is about the drop dead date is on October. So July, August, September, October. They have 4 more months for it to go through the courts to determine whether or not they can put on the question about citizenship on the census. And what they're deciding, the court has to decide is this for a legitimate reason? Because generally speaking, the president has the right to do that. If it's not for some sort of racially charged reason or, something that violates the Constitution, which there's arguments that it may. There are arguments that it may.
Doesn't it really come down to which specious argument do you agree with? Because the people who oppose say, well, people aren't going to fill out their census forms. Well, sure they do. They just fill out the census form and say, no, I'm not a citizen. There are many people who are in this country legally who are not citizens. How would that stop them from filling out the form?
Well, I'm going to throw the other side against you there, Cal. So you ask yourself, you have to put yourself in a migrant worker. Just put yourself in this person. Everybody sit back and listen.
Sure.
This is important.
Can we play some music here?
Put your fingers put your thumbs on your index fingers, lean back and put your head back.
And now it's time for Let's Hear What It's Really All About
by
Fred Penney.
So the census guy comes around, and you're here not legally, but you're here helping, working in the fields. And again, I'm not politically staying one side or the other. And you're a great person, and you're a wonderful family, and you're making decent money, and say you're picking fruit, and you're helping the farmer out. And you've never had any issues with, the law. And all of a sudden they say, will you fill this census form out and put down whether or not you're a citizen? Cal, let's be realistic. How many of them are going to raise their hand and say, yep, I'm filling that baby out?
How many are going to fill it out anyway? That's my point. You can't statistically prove that fewer people would fill it out if that checkbox was there. And by the way, they could put a third box that says prefer not to state.
Yes, no, that would be a good idea too. That's a good idea, Cal. Yeah. Cal just came up with the answer.
I just solved the problem.
I just solved the problem.
Yeah.
President Trump, there it is. Just add that in. Cal Hunter. That is actually a great idea.
I would think so.
I would say, I'm not responding.
Just historically historically, there have been 23 of these type of censuses taken from 1790 to up until the most recent in 2010. 23 of them in the history of our country. And up until, I believe, or between 1820 and 1950, and there was always a question that asked in some sense, in some way, about your citizenship. It didn't stop until
origin?
then.
Well, some of them said, what is your origin?
Yes, and so the idea that this has never been asked or it's egregious, well, why was it asked for nearly 150 years prior to now? But, we get to the issue where it wasn't asked for a while, and now they want to ask it again.
My wife was she's a census worker. She's worked on 2 of these. And she said the bigger problem you have is there are many people who simply do not want to fill out the form. Doesn't matter. People that have been in this country their whole life, multi-generational people, I don't want the government knowing about me and if I have a flush toilet. I mean, they just don't want to fill out the form.
Well, I think it's going to come down to, if it wasn't Trump, if it was someone else, they probably wouldn't have said anything about it. But here's what's interesting, and we'll get to that, Todd.
Sure.
So the ruling that's interesting about this issue is, did you know that by a 5-4 majority, don't forget, it was 9-0 to send it back to the lower court. So everyone's like, oh, it was a majority. No, the majority was just to send it back to the lower courts, which even I agree with. It went too fast. The lower courts are the courts that have to do the fact finding. The Supreme Court's not a fact, doesn't do that. So that's what was a 9-0, but it was 5-4 split in Trump's favor, saying, quote, the majority of the Supreme Court held under a 5-4 that the executive branch has, quote, broad authority to decide what goes into the census. And so people don't realize, but what's going to happen now is Trump has to decide 2 things. Number one, do we push it off till October and try to push it through? There's 2 cases, Maryland and New York, that have brought lawsuits to not put this citizenship question on the census. Right now, as it stands, the Maryland judge says he's going to push it quickly through, so that might be taken care of quickly. And so we'll have to see, what's going on. Now, is it going to be more difficult to put it on? Yes. I mean, this is clearly, more difficult for the Trump administration to get this on. And you have a comment before I get into what the justices says, why they didn't like the way that this came down with the Trump administration.
Well, the one thing that I have, just to answer Cal's statement that, some people just aren't going to fill it out and they don't want to fill out at all. And I mean, the fact that we have something that only comes along every 10 years. So if you were 10 years old when the last one came around, you're 20 now, and the next time it comes around, you're going to be 30. It's not something that people are presented with on a semi-frequent basis, like an election or something like that.
Or taxes.
Or taxes. And it's easy for folks to not understand why it is we do this and how these figures are used, what programs are funded by this, how the Electoral College is affected, how all sorts of things. And if you don't understand this, it's very easy to take a micro focus on it and say, well, this is just about somebody wanting to know who's here legally or not because they're going to round them all up and send them back. And that, quite frankly, is a very minor issue. But I'm not going to overlook the fact that as Fred said, the average person looking at it is going to say, do I trust the government to simply use this for a census? I'll give you a classic example of lack of trust. And this goes to baseball and Barry Bonds. They did the testing for baseball. They came in, everybody said, no, we're not using this for anything but baseball. And then the IRS came in and subpoenaed the records that were all supposed to be anonymous, and now you got people being prosecuted for it. They don't trust the government. Our Constitution arguably is founded upon the principle that you can't always trust the government. So I kind of understand where they're coming from.
I still think it's key when you make an argument before the Supreme Court and said, we know that fewer people will fill this out, that you'd better be able to establish that rather than just express an opinion. And they have I don't think there's ever been a survey or a study or anything else.
But I think the issue is, and we're going to get into this when we come back from the break, is how this was done. They came forth. The reason that they did this, according to the Trump administration, is basically to make sure that everybody is equally represented, including those Hispanics or the minorities. Which even Roberts, the conservative guy, is going, wait a minute here. What's the real reason? All they, Roberts is basically saying, just let's lay the real reason out, and that's what the court wants. And Maryland, and I'm going to, back from the break, I'm going to talk about what the Maryland courts are seeing and what they're going to discuss in New York courts and how this applies to this citizenship question on the census, because this is really intriguing. Even though, I tell you, in 10 years from now, the next census, nobody's going to care what's going on. But I still think, and I'm just telling you, people are going to see that, whether you're Democrat, Republican, middle, they're going to go, I'm not going to answer that. And how are they going to find them? You didn't fill your census out. Todd, during the break we were talking about this. We didn't stop talking about the census thing. You had some interesting points to bring up.
Well, there's a tone anytime the Supreme Court issues a decision. And sometimes it doesn't come out in the actual language, but you kind of get a feeling that what's the court really saying here? And when the Supreme Court in this decision said and talked about how the executive agency, the Department of Congress, has great latitude in deciding what does or does not go on a census. And when they make a statement here and this is a direct quote from the opinion, when the court says, quote, a court may not reject an agency's stated reasons for acting, i.e., adding a question onto the census, simply because the agency might also have had other unstated reasons, and a court may not set aside an agency's policymaking decision solely because it might have been influenced by political considerations or prompted by an administration's priorities. And, when they make a statement like that, I see, in essence, the court saying to the Trump administration and to the Department of Commerce, you guys probably could have added this question because you have great latitude, but you went to such lengths to try to cover up or obscure what you were really thinking, that in and of itself is what created the suspicion. And now we have to get it sorted out. If you just said this is what we want to do, then it would have been fine. It's interesting to note that when it was still in the lower court level, normally the lower judge makes a decision based upon the administrative record. But in certain circumstances, the court can allow what's called extra discovery, and the court did. And one of those extra discovery pieces was a subpoena to Secretary Ross, who oversees the Department of Commerce, for him to be deposed, to basically come in and, I want to hear from your mouth, explain why this happened. Well, that deposition was stayed. And so now, when it gets sent back down, arguably that deposition is going to have to occur so that we can figure out, and the court can figure out what he was thinking as opposed to trying to divine it from the record in the case. And if they come up with a legitimate reason, arguably the census question is going to be okay. The problem is they're up against time.
Yeah, that's when you talk about all that.
Yeah.
The timing even through October is going to be difficult because, by the way, one of the reasons, and I've seen a lot of conservative pundits out there just rip on Roberts, who's a conservative justice. I'm saying, you know what? And by the way, I've met him personally. He's a very nice guy. He's basically said there's no good reason to add this right now. And don't forget, the Trump administration says we're doing it to enforce the Voting Rights Act, which is to make sure there's no minorities that are kind of left out. And Roberts says that's not right. We don't know that. That doesn't sound right. And you have all these ancillary and backdoor stuff that you're trying to get it in that we have to investigate, and that's why it needs to go down to the lower court. In fact, he said, quote, Roberts said that they may, that is the Trump administration and the Commerce Department, may have a constitutional and legal right to add the question.
Yeah. The problem that they had was that the factual record was not squaring up and matching with the documentary record. So to the extent they were saying, look, this needs to be added so the Department of Justice can enforce the VR, the Voting Rights Act. Well, the problem was when you look at the record and all the emails and stuff sent back and forth, adding this question was on the radar of the Department of Commerce before the Department of Justice even raised the issue. And in fact, the DOJ only raised the issue because the Department of Commerce went to them and said, hey, you think this might be good for you? And so, it's just the information they provided was not matching the explanations that were provided,
Right.
which created the confusion, and they have to get that figured out.
Right, and that's why people are like, oh, they lost. No, it's actually just saying we're gonna run this through the normal process. Now, the question is, Todd, did they kind of play their hand and sour was there a couple of sour apples in the big apple pen right now? You know, having done this, the justices are now kind of turning their head going, yeah, you know, what's the real reason? Because the issue is, does this violate, this putting whether or not you're a citizen on the census, violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? If it does, then it's out.
Well, I think the biggest issue here is going to be whatever justification is provided. Somebody's going to look at it and say, okay, let's assume that is the correct justification. Why is it that you told us something different the first time?
Right.
How come it's different here? And somebody's going to have to do that. But I want to be clear, and the court was clear, after they said we're going to remand this down so that this can be decided in lower court, the last thing they said before they said it is so ordered is, we do not hold that the agency decision here was substantively invalid. But agencies must pursue their goals reasonably. Reasoned decision-making under the Administrative Procedure Act calls for an explanation for agency action. What was provided here was more of a distraction. So there may very well be a justification. They just have an issue. Ultimately, they never got to the question about whether or not it was an appropriate question. They talked about procedure.
Right. Here's the interesting thing. I want you to go back. Here's the simple way to put it after we've gone through all these legal analysis. Remember back when you were a little kid? And my dad was he believed in corporal punishment. I'm sorry, but that's the way I grew up. We had the stick. Freddie, what? Did you use the coloring crayon and color on Mom's wall? No. Whap! And son, if you would have told me you did it, I wouldn't have swatted you. So that I kind of see that as a simple way of saying, you know what, just tell us the reason and just lay it out and make it simple, and then we'll tell you whether or not it's a Equal Protection Clause issue. But here's the other thing I want to point out before I get to you, Cal, is the important thing is it's still really, even if they laid it out right, I still think the court would have said, you got to send it back down, and we've got to go through the process.
Well, I think they're trying to find a way to say what's wrong with the truth and what's wrong with procedure. How about you tell us the truth, and how about you follow typical procedure?
Well, I don't necessarily you're going to call it truth or lying, and people go, "Oh, you're a Trump guy."
I'm saying if you change your story, then you obviously got you're not confident in your reasons,
or you're picking the wrong. Okay, which reason are you going to use this? Well, what's the real reason? I mean, you can't just pick one, and government does that all the time. By the way, it's not the first time.
True.
You know, the thing I like about this decision really has nothing to do with the merits of the decision itself. And the thing I like about all the decisions that came down from the Supreme Court, even the ones that I may not agree with, is that it's an example of the fact that the justices are making decisions based upon their interpretation of the law and the reasoned arguments of the law, whether I agree with them or not, and they are not making decisions based upon the political persuasion of the president that appointed them. And all of these arguments that you hear from people during the confirmation process about, oh my gosh, this law is going to be overturned, that's going to be overturned, it's going to be shaped, the whole country is going to be conservative, the whole country is going to be liberal. It just doesn't shake out that way. When they get on the court, they make their decision based upon how they perceive it. There have been plenty of decisions that have gone against Trump by the two people he has appointed, and I like that. You can't buy the justices.
Yeah, what's interesting, too, about it, and we're going to go to a break here in a minute and end our wonderful first hour with Todd, Cal, and I, the Three Musketeers. You know, what's important is this is not going to end.
No.
We're going to talk about this until October. I think the Trump administration's going to put off printing it out until October to decide how or what they want to do, see if the courts move a little bit quicker. As weird as this sounds, I know this is bizarre. Not bizarre, but it's a little – you know what I say? Who cares? I know that sounds weird. Oh, my gosh. I don't think it's going to it's not going to end the world if the words, are you a citizen or not, on the census is going to ruin this country one way or the other, Cal.
It's just for genealogical and historical research that information becomes valuable 2, 3, 4, 5 generations down the road. It
Yeah,
doesn't matter today.
But it hasn't been on since 1950. There's been no issues. So I just don't see it as it's so blown out of proportion because it's the Trump administration. This would have been just a normal review. Yes, no. I just think it's just not worth fighting over. Let's get the economy going and help people out in this world. And that's my soapbox for this hour. Well, thanks for this hour hanging out with Todd and I and Cal. We will see you next time, or go to Radio Law Talk.
Go to the website, radiolawtalk.com. That's radiolawtalk.com.